I'm going to be talking to Ester de Maio de Cunha from the Clean Energy Research Group at Simon Fraser University about establishing an effective investment ecosystem in Vancouver's Cleantech cluster, particularly with respect to hydrogen fuel cell startups. So welcome to the interview, Ester.
Happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, look, thank you for coming. And why don't you start? You've written a paper about this. Why don't we start with an overview of your paper, please?
Sure. So I decided to write this paper because I studied a little bit about clean energy policies and clean energy startups during my bachelor's degree and during my first year of master's degree. And I figured out that there was a problem in the clean tech cluster here in Vancouver, that startups didn't have enough financial support from the government and even private investors, such as venture capital companies or angel investors. So I decided to do a research related to how to bring more investors or financial support to startups in Vancouver. And I did a comparative analysis of different clusters. I selected Silicon Valley in the US, Cambridge in the UK, Tel Aviv, and Singapore, because they had more successful investments to clean tech startups. And I discovered that they have more tax incentives and co-investments coming from the government and even some private corporations. In this case, could be large corporations and even investors, so from venture capital companies and angel investors. And I think Vancouver has a potential to grow the clean tech cluster right now if they incorporate more tax incentives and co-investments together with the grants, loan guarantees, and credit supply that they already have.
So let's talk about that. So the startups generally have adequate credit, loan guarantees and grants at a Series A and Series B level. So, in fairly early in their life. But in your paper, you talk about the valley of death, and that's where you get to the point where you want to, maybe you're out of the lab, you're into the pilot project, something like that, and you need to scale up. And the capital, is that the capital that we need to bridge the valley of death?
Yeah, Vancouver has very good startups during the ideation phase that we call. So it's just the first early steps, but they cannot grow a little bit more with Series A and B because they lack this capital, and then they need to partner with some American companies or other companies around the world, or even find American investors. And this is how they get the startups from Vancouver to Silicon Valley or other places in the US, because they can receive more financial support. So right now, Vancouver needs to get these investments to grow the startups here, to maintain the local economy strong and grow it.
Now, I was reading just the other day about Silicon Valley and how there's a culture of an investment culture around startups, and successful startup entrepreneurs who have been, so once they've made their millions or billions, they get back into it, and they put their money into new startups, and there's a culture around there. Everybody gets excited about new ideas, new startups. They put their money into it, and that's what gets propels the startups to growth. Is that something that's missing in Vancouver? From your comments, it seems like it is.
Yes, it is missing. Silicon Valley is considered one of the oldest clean tech clusters in the world. So they've started in the 1960s with this culture of creating startups and growing to large companies and investing in other startups. Vancouver has a quite limited number of startups. It's a very small cluster when compared to Silicon Valley. And we are quite risk averse when compared to Silicon Valley, like startups. So the risk aversion is the main concern, that they cannot bring this culture to Canada, to Vancouver.
Right now, some of the other clusters that you mentioned, like Singapore and Tel Aviv, are also smaller than Silicon Valley, obviously. Do they have the same problems, or have they managed to get over that issue of capital to bridge the valley of death?
So Tel Aviv and Singapore could manage to grow their clusters, having very strong support of their governments. And it helped them to construct a culture of entrepreneurship and communication and networking with small and medium enterprises in those two clusters. So it creates a very solid base that helps the startups to grow. And Vancouver is lacking a little bit on this type of networking and communication and public support to grow.
So it sounds like there's two options here. One, the Silicon Valley model, where you've got this big cluster of investors and entrepreneurs and technical people. It almost self-funds itself in a way. And then you have the other model, like Singapore, Cambridge, and Tel Aviv, where governments have to play a much more active role. And it sounds like in that case, Vancouver is falling down and Canada is falling down in terms of providing the policy, regulation, and funding to build that cluster out and give it the resources it needs to grow.
Yeah, Vancouver should consider all these clusters, because you do have some important policy tools from the Silicon Valley cluster, such as tax incentives. The government of California provides some specific tax incentives to customers, and even tax incentives to the small companies. But they do have, Singapore and Tel Aviv do have very interesting forms of policy tools that don't interact with tax incentives, but they have more loan guarantees, credit supply, and grants. They have better communication with other parts of the industry, not just the Cleantech sector, but also universities, labs, incubators, accelerators that work together to provide all these types of programs or policy tools that they call to these startups. So you should consider, Vancouver should consider Silicon Valley in terms of in the long run, but in the short run, right now, they should look at Tel Aviv and Singapore.
Final question, Esther. When you were doing your research, did you run across any indication from the British Columbia government or from the Canadian government that they recognize that there's a problem and they're willing to step up with policy, regulations, and funding to fix the problems that you've identified in your paper?
Yes, I interviewed some experts from the BC government and even the Canadian government. They are aware of this kind of concern that they should provide more financial support to startups. They think, and I also agree with them, that the cluster is working well. But it should be more effective in terms of financial support. They think they should have more policy tools, a diverse type of policy tools, and this is why I mentioned during my research that you should consider different types of policy tools to give this necessary support. So they are aware of that, and I think they would consider these types of recommendations I've done during my research, that you should take other clusters as examples, successful examples that Vancouver should follow, and take specific policy tools to give a little bit of financial support to different types of startups that might need different types of financial assistance. So there are different types of startups as well. And considering this diversity is also important for the government to provide better services.
Esther, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.